at Center of German Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University. എനിവേ ഇത് ഏകദേശം ഒരു JNU ക്ലാസ് റൂം പോലെ ഇരിപ്പുണ്ട്. സാധാരണ രീതിയിൽ ഞങ്ങൾക്ക് ഒരു മാക്സിമം 10 സ്റ്റുഡൻസൊക്കെ ഉണ്ടാകാറുള്ളൂ ഒരു ക്ലാസ് റൂമിൽ. ദ ഓൺലി ഡിഫറൻസ് ഈസ് ദിസ് ഇസ് എ ബിഗർ ഹാൾ. The classrooms are pretty smaller in JNU. So I'll speak in English, though I teach in German, so that my English will smack of German a bit. The subject is the philosophy, literature, and society. Well, I studied literature for 2 years in JNU, but then I moved to philosophy. So I must admit that my area is philosophy. So I'll be talking more about philosophy and society, and I'll try my best to connect that through the literature. Just to share, or how to start this lecture, just to share a personal experience. I remember a time in 92, I was in JNU for masters in German literature. I did first civil engineering from Trivandrum Engineering College and then moved to literature. So JNU was the only university which would accept an engineer for literature and philosophy. Anyway, so it was very intense, that atmosphere, academic atmosphere, so charged with philosophy. So there were a lot of discussion on Kant, Hegel, Karl Marx, but the paradigm was postmodernism. A lot of discussion on Derrida, Foucault, Lyotard, Deleuze, and others. I still remember, the School of Language, the Center for English, or Center of German Studies, or Center of French Linguistics, all these centers used to do a lot of philosophy. So philosophy was invariably a course. And as a matter of fact, Department of Philosophy was a part of School of Language and Literature. So there was a discussion, a very heated debate between some colleagues from the School of English Studies that produced many philosophers and the Center of German Studies. So the argument or the question was comparing literature and philosophy. So writing philosophy and writing literature, which would be of greater value? Yeah. So the philosophers, of course, are famous, renowned, and very unique. Think of Kant, Hegel, or the Indian philosophers. But writing something like Critique of Pure Reason, for which Kant prepared for 25 years and wrote in 5 months, or writing a novel like Crime and Punishment or Idiot of Dostoevsky. Which of these two different assignments could have a greater value? Obviously, there are two sides. So those who do literature would argue for Dostoevsky, those who do philosophy would argue for Kant. But surprisingly, there were more agreement than disagreement. We all agreed that writing a novel like Idiot would be of great value. Later, I must correct it, but then I still believe in that. So then after my 2 years of MA, I went to Germany in a very traditional and orthodox school of philosophy, which is Freiburg im Breisgau in southwest Germany, which has a legacy from Albertus Magnus, and particularly with Martin Heidegger, who was professor there, and Edmund Husserl, who was professor of Martin Heidegger, and Heinrich Rickert, a neo-Kantian school. Max Weber was there. Well, obviously, Freiburg is still a place for Heidegger research. There it was different. So my first pro seminar was on Plato, Phaedrus. It's a pro seminar, that is the BA level. So I had to do the entire philosophy there, and including Latin and logic and all. And it was on Platon's brief, the Plato's letter, where he criticized the script, the Schrift critique of Platon. And then I submitted my assignment, and it was rejected. It was rejected with the explanation, the language is very literary. I used lot of adjectives which you are not supposed to use in philosophy, metaphor, a kind of poetic language. The reason because when I was in JNU, I worked intensively on Friedrich Nietzsche and Heine and Thomas Mann and others. So that affected that shaped or fashioned my style and all. So a lot of pathos, style, and more literary. And then the Dozent means the lecturer in Germany, he told me, see, you're in Halt. In Halt means the content is absolutely fine, but the language you have to unlearn, deconstruct, and learn the philosophical language. And I didn't know what the philosophical language is. And he even made this remark, something of this kind, you can submit in Paris, but not in Freiburg. See, that's the divide. So if you are in France, this is acceptable. But if you are in Germany, this is not acceptable. So you have to just forget your literary language, unlearn that language, and train in a philosophical language. And this misery continued with the first guide, who was a student of Martin Heidegger, Ute Guzzoni, and we had great disagreements. So she was insisting on a particular use of language. And I was a bit irritated, and I asked, is there a standard language for philosophy? Yeah. And in German tradition, Kant had a style, and Hegel had a different style, and then Nietzsche. So what's the style of Nietzsche? But that's a German background. So if you are a Nietzsche, then you can write like that. I was not a Nietzsche. I was an ordinary student. So an ordinary student cannot raise such claims. You had to follow the norms. So this is a major difference between the two dominant schools of philosophy in Europe, which is French and German. And just Freiburg is at the border. You cross the border, you'll reach Colmar and Strasbourg, and Paris is just 5 hours drive. You go to Paris, and you will experience a different tradition, where philosophers were and still are literary figures. So France has a long tradition, from Voltaire to Sartre or even after, that they all wrote novels. Henry Bergson got Nobel Prize for literature. Sartre got Nobel Prize, and he refused that later, for literature. And Voltaire wrote novels. And again, the divide between Germany and France, the Habermas was saying, no, Derrida and others, they write more literature and not philosophy. But as a matter of fact, even Habermas is not writing philosophy in that sense. And if you follow the strict Kantian or Leibnizian or Hegelian standards. So this is a problem in philosophy. Yeah? It's not that the philosophy is not literature. Philosophy is clearly not literature. But how to write philosophy? So what kind of language we have to use? And why they are insisting on that? And if you move to England, it's again a different story. So, with this short introduction, I just want to begin with a few points as a propedeutic, as an introduction. The nexus between literature and society. Yeah, and it's very obvious. For literature, actually the nexus between philosophy, literature, and society. So my attempt is to show how literature can connect philosophy and society in certain sense and in the history. So the nexus between literature and history is very obvious. So literature refers or is based on society, the social reality, the human relations, the family, love, emotions, man and nature, man and technology, memories, wars, alienation, estrangement, deaths, friendship, etc., etc. Right. Now we move to the nexus between philosophy and society. Interestingly, any of these themes of literature can be a subject of philosophy. There is philosophy of love, philosophy of friendship, memory in a major way in phenomenology and Paul Ricoeur and many others, estrangement, death, Heidegger, for example, family, all these things. All these can be the object of philosophy. But still, philosophy cannot be restricted to this domain, to these traditions. it should transcend the bounds of ethnicity, history, society, and the individual. So that's the fate. That's the fate of philosophy. Why? Because it's an Aristotelian legacy. It's the first science. It is highly reductionist. That means philosophy is the first science. It's a primordial science. It should refer finally to the being. So if you read the metaphysics of Aristotle, he gives all these examples, but still like deconstructing that as eliminating the accidents, and referring to the final object of philosophy, which is being qua being. Yeah. So the being qua being, that actually in which everything is negated. All that could have been the object of literature. Yeah, emotions, love, colors, secondary quality, etc., etc. Because of this nature, philosophy as a subject differs completely from other disciplines. So we say, like in Germany has a tradition of naming the faculty as philosophy faculties. So the first faculty is obviously the theoretical philosophy and the philosophy in general. Then the philology is also a philosophical faculty. Sociology is also a philosophical faculty. That's the third faculty. And till the natural science. Yeah, and the degree is given as Doctor Phil, so the doctorate in philosophy, so which is originally from Heidelberg. So another example is the politics. Obviously, the politics is from philosophy. So there is politeia of Plato and politics of Aristotle, many political theories in the early modernity. So there is a philosophy of, clear tradition of the philosophy of politics, but what is possible in politics is not possible in philosophy, which is the foundation of epistemology. So the Plato, while establishing the epistemology, clearly differentiates between doxa and episteme. So the doxa is belief, opinion, but episteme is knowledge. So when you defend knowledge in philosophy, you have to eliminate the doxa, which is the business of sophist, so that he was an anti-sophist. But in politics, all these are legitimized. In the politics, there should be opinions, beliefs, and other things. So that's how this very complicated correlation between philosophy and other disciplines that also include literature. So the meaning of philosophy is philosophia, the lover, loving the wisdom or loving the truth. But Sophia is wisdom in Greek. Another example I want to just highlight is from Immanuel Kant, so the Critique of Pure Reason. It's a huge work. You know, I mean, to read Critique of Pure Reason, you need at least 2 or 3 years. And it doesn't guarantee that you understand the work also. It's quite complex. But I focus mainly on the first, transcendental aesthetics. But towards the end of Critique of Pure Reason, there's a very interesting discourse of Immanuel Kant concerning the same Platonic problem of belief, knowledge, and belief, opinion, and knowledge. So in German, it is Meinung. Meinung is opinion. Glauben is Wissen. Glauben is belief, and Wissen is knowledge. Okay, I'm not going to use the German anyway. So he has this subject on the one hand, the domain of subject, and the domain of object. So closer to the subject, it will be an opinion. So I have my opinion, you have your opinion. I try to convince you of my opinion, but in most of the case, it will be a persuasion, which happens in political field. You know, they use this rhetoric to impose certain belief system on your opinion on you. The second domain is the religion, the belief, which is somewhere in middle of subject and object. Yeah? It is not just my belief, it's our belief. So you're moving from that individual subjectivity to a collective subjectivity of a community, which is the religion. But the third, the knowledge, is closest to the object. Yeah? it is both by individual and by the community accepted as a tool of conviction, not persuasion. So the German words are Überzeugung for conviction and Überreden for persuasion. So what Kant was trying to say, that episteme means you are closer to the object. And it's about the objectivity of knowledge. Yeah? But whereas opinion is more subjective. Yeah? That's a very fantastic, as a standard of how to differentiate between doxa and episteme from Plato to Kant. And another example I want to highlight is the problem involved here between different forms of knowledge, and why or how come philosophical knowledge has to be the most fundamental and objective. It's just like a building construction. So there are very boring initial stages of like taking the trenching and putting the foundation, and you see all the reinforcement and the concreting and all. Normally the clients won't visit the building site in this time because they have no clue, they have no idea. But when the finishing starts, everybody is interested. So the wood and the plastering and the colors and all. The fact is that all this ornamentic, you can ascribe to the various sciences. Yeah, like literature, for example. But for philosophy, you have to focus on the foundation. Yeah, so for example, you have a new house and somebody visits your house, and I visit your house, and then I have my limits in appreciating and criticizing your house. I could probably say, this could have been a different color, you could have used a different texture for the curtains, or the flooring could have been better, and all these things, or the windows are a bit smaller, so etc., etc. But if I grab the foundation and say that it is not safe, you won't tolerate. Yeah? This is exactly the duty of philosopher. That's the reason why the science always hated philosophy. Philosophy goes beyond the axiom. So that's the difference between science and philosophy. Science stops with the axiom, and philosophy problematizes the axiom. Philosophy has to problematize the axiom, and that is its mode of existence. Why? Because of this Platonic foundation. So that is in Politeia, I think in the 7th book, the famous cave allegory of Plato. So, I don't want to explain that cave allegory. There is a kind of hierarchy of knowledge. So it begins with the lot of, men sitting in a cave, in a dark cave, who they cannot move their heads, and there is a light. It's an artificial light behind them, and they can only see the shadows of fake objects. So it's a deception of a second degree. Yeah. So fake light, fake objects, and then shadows. So one of them can free himself and turn back and see the light and the fake object. So that's the first step of knowledge. But still it's a deception. And he comes out of the cave and sees the original objects. But for Plato, the original object which we can see through our senses, eyes, these are again images of eternal ideas. These are again fake, a kind of imitation of eternal ideas. Higher than that, there are mathematical objects, and above mathematics, which are eternally true, eternally existing, and higher than mathematical object, there is ideas, justice, beauty, or kindness, all these ideas. Still, there is an idea which is higher than all the ideas, which is the goodness. So he compares goodness with sun, and it has to illuminate all other ideas. So there is a hierarchy from the shadows to the sun of different epistemic levels. And the actual objects of our sensation is, for Plato, is an imitation of ideas. So Plato is clearly referring to the being which transcends all the secondary quality and other worldly things, and one should transcend this worldly thing to reach the idea. And because of this foundation, philosophy always had problem with literature. Yeah? And Plato is the first philosopher. It's a paradox. He said you should ban all the poets, artists, and all those who write literature from the society. But the fact was he was a great literary figure. You read Plato's dialogues, it's more literature than philosophy. So that is the paradox. He was a great poet when he was young. Yeah? There was a reason why Plato said that, because of the sophist. Because the sophist used rhetoric to deceive the audience. And Plato wanted to establish the episteme, the knowledge, as the foundation of philosophy and counter this deceptive literature of the sophist. But still, the difference or the contradiction between philosophy and literature is philosophy do work on literary objects. As I told you earlier, the emotions and love and friendship, human relations and all. But there is a progression from the particular to the universal. Yeah? Also from sensation, the sensation always is fragmented, so we see different objects in particular, and from the particularity to the generality, always. Yeah? Or from emotion to rational and all these things. So this reduction to one principle, which existed in Greece and later in Europe, literature reversed this order. So what happens in literature, from understanding it goes back to sensation, and from logos to the actual objects, and from universal to the particular, and from rational to emotional. So, but then philosophy never left this dichotomy with literature, and it became a subject of philosophy, especially in the medieval scholasticism, the great discourse on universals and the particulars. It's the conflict between realism and nominalism. There were nominalists like Duns Scotus and Ockham, and then the realists who actually emphasized the reality of the eternal ideas. So that conflict between universals and particulars always existed in philosophy. And if you ask me, what the philosophers had defended, that was the idea. So the philosophy has a basic tendency to reduce the complexity or the plurality of this world of appearance into a few entities. And it's a kind of, we call it an ontological reduction. Okay, the next thing I want to discuss is the history. And obviously, the history is an object of philosophy. And particularly in the 19th century, so the advent of philosophies of history from Kant, so the universal history or Hegel's, the philosophy of history or the phenomenology of spirit, phenomenology des Geistes, the historical manifestation of the spirit, and the later philosophies of history. But now the question is, can we reverse that? Can we determine that is philosophy historical or ahistorical? So that means, like we have a history of philosophy, Greek or Indian, Chinese, Greek, Roman, early modern, and the present philosophy. But then, what's the nature of philosophy? Is it historical or ahistorical? Yeah? That means it's the same way like the philosophies of the past can be negated, and we only accept the present philosophy. No, obviously not. Yeah, so there is a kind of metaphor which our professors used to explain in the classes. So it's not a highway that you start from Cochin to reach Mangalore or Bangalore. No? It's not a highway. So you have to come back to the same foundation again and again. So that's the nature of philosophy. It makes progresses, but comes back to the same foundation. So you read Aristotle, this obsession with being qua being, with Aristotle, or the Platonic obsession with ideas, or Descartes defining philosophy as the philosophy of first principle, meditation, the philosophy of first principles, and Kant, and actually everyone. And because of that, the philosophy has a tendency to transcend the object that normally the literature use throughout its history. Yeah? So that's a conflicting point between philosophy and literature. But, there is clearly a tradition of literary theories, which is philosophy. The philosophy is applied in literary theories. And so we teach that in our universities now. Okay, and philosophy is also not subject to culture. So we can simply other the philosophy, like this is Indian and this is Greek, yeah, or this is Roman and this is Greek, or Chinese or Western and all, or Occidental and Oriental. So again, there are differences at the practical philosophy, level of practical philosophy. But if you examine the theoretical philosophy, you will find striking similarities between the theoretical disciplines or the classical schools of India and the Greek, or the questions that were discussed, the fundamental questions, etc. So, like Goethe has an idea of universal literature, and philosophy has it as an intrinsic idea. Philosophy is universal. So it cannot be segregated following the national barriers or cultural barriers or the historical barriers. And see, the first university was founded by Plato. It's a very interesting story about that. He has written most of his philosophies, and now, like according to Plato, after that state, that phase of philosophizing, you have to practice philosophy. And he hailed from a very old nobility, of the Athenian nobility, and he had his relatives, his uncles, who were tyrants at that time. So in Asia Minor, so not in Athens. In Athens, it was democracy. So he tried to emancipate, he tried to enlighten these tyrants and failed miserably. 3 times he failed. And the 3rd time, they took Plato somewhere else, and he was sold in a slave market. The greatest philosopher was sold in a slave market. And fortunately, there was a student of Plato there. He bought Plato, and he was very rich, and brought him back to Athens. And Plato had to give the entire, the money or the property he inherited from his family to the student, but the student refused to accept that. He was a student of Socrates. So with that money, he founded the university. So നമ്മൾ പച്ച മലയാളത്തിൽ പറയുകയാണെങ്കിൽ ഈ ഫിലോസഫറെ വിറ്റ കാശുകൊണ്ടാണ് ആദ്യത്തെ യൂണിവേഴ്സിറ്റി ഉണ്ടാക്കിയിരിക്കുന്നത്. So that was the foundation of university. The idea is, it stands for the universalism. It stands for the universality of knowledge, universality of logos, or the universality of being, ethics, politics, aesthetics, the universality of science. Yeah? So the university is not a national institute. This is the point. It cannot be national. If it's a national institution, then I cannot teach Kant. I would be an anti-national, for example. Yeah? So if the university cannot be national, it cannot be anti-national. So that universalism, that is the foundation of universities from Plato, and that became the foundation of the philosophy also. So to summarize this first phase of my lecture, so the basic question, is philosophy linked with a society and its history? So the second question, how are philosophy, literature, and society connected? What's the nexus between philosophy, literature, and society? And how does literature form a link between philosophy and society? So now I want to highlight a general phases in philosophy and the society. And in all these cultures, like in India, I'm sure in China also, and particularly in Greece and Europe later, there was 2 phases of philosophy. And I mean, we broadly classify that an ontological phase and an epistemological phase. So first, it was the philosophy of nature, the philosophy of object. So you think of all the pre-Socratians, from Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Heraclit, Parmenides, or Democritus, I mean, the quest for the basic substance. So what lies under this fragmented reality of the world. So it is about the world. It was not about the knowing subject. So it was about the object. But with Socrates, you can observe a change. So the mind became the object of philosophy. Yeah. So, like we call it the midwife's job to take out the knowledge from your mind. Yeah. So that I know that I don't know. So that you have to. There's a dialectic process where you have to take out the knowledge a priori that already in your mind, and that is the epistemological term in certain sense. But it was not quite clear in the Greek tradition, and that's why Nietzsche said all the philosophers after Socrates were mixed characters, mish character, and like Plato and Aristotle, because they mixed the philosophy, like Plato synthesizing Heraclit, Parmenides, Pythagoras, and Socrates, etc., etc. But moving to, maybe in India also from Sankhya to Vedanta, so you can find a kind of transition from the philosophy of object to the philosophy of subject. But clearly in medieval scholasticism, this was very dominant, this divide between philosophy of object and then later the philosophy of subject. So one of the major discourse of the medieval scholasticism was the principle of individuation, the problem of individuation. How do the object individuate? That objects means natural object and metaphysical objects like soul and angels and God, including God, and the secondary qualities like colors, sound and taste and all, celestial bodies, everything. So the basic question was the question of individuation. The cause of individuation, which is principium individuationis, the principle of individuation. And there is the extensive individuation, intensive, a lot of classification. And this was a debate over 300 years, or more than that, the principle of individuation. So there are very interesting discourse like the existence of angels. If the angels exist, how they exist? Are they extended in space? Are they extended in time? And etc., etc. Surprisingly, this ontological discourse completely vanished in the early modernity. So there are many studies on this phenomenon in the history. So this ontological discourse till Suarez, you can see that. And after 40 years, Descartes wrote Meditations, and this discourse was completely missing because Descartes had another program, another strategy of introducing the epistemological turn. So there are two major scientists or philosophers who work on that. One is George Grazia, and Kenneth Barber, both from States. They have published a number of works on this phenomena and defining two particular models. One is the strong model and the other is the weak model. So according to them, the weak model ruled the medieval scholasticism. That means the weak model where there is a parallel relation between epistemology and ontology. So the epistemology, the theory of knowledge, has only the limited function to support the ontology. That means you cannot question the existence of God, but still you can examine the existence of God, or likewise the angels or soul, and your knowledge should support it. The moment you question the existence of God, that could be a sufficient reason for heresy, and what will happen, there will be an inquisition and you will be burned at stake. So this would happen. So the epistemology and ontology are parallel streams, and at the same time, the ontology dominates the question of existence, and the theory of knowledge should support this. So there are two aspects. One is the cognizability or the knowability and the existence. So these are parallel, but at the same time, the knowability was subject to the existence. And what happened with Descartes, he completely reversed this relation. And it is the knowability that alone can guarantee the existence. Everything should put into scrutiny, including the God. So that is the famous Cartesian epistemological turn, and he established through few works like the Discourse on Method, Discourse della Methode, Meditations, and Principe della Philosophie, the Principles of Philosophy. And the major tool he deployed was the method of doubt. So this is for the first time in the history of philosophy, the method of doubt and negation became the most important epistemological tool in philosophy. If you read Meditation from the beginning itself, so you can see how Descartes used the method of negation and separation in order to distill that absolute certain subject. Yeah? So you negate the secondary qualia, you negate all the subjective attributes, and finally by doubting the existence. No? So it's an age of doubt. But you cannot doubt the fact that you doubt. So that is the final. I think, therefore I am. Yeah? Res cogitans. And this is the divide between the thinking substance and the extended substance. Res cogitans and res extensa. And the method used was the method of negation. So you can see the change from an age of belief and to the age of doubt and negation. Yeah? It is not just that reason evolved out of certainty. No, the reason evolved out of doubt and skepsis. So the whole problem of, like, I exist even without my body, the mind-body dualism and all. Okay, then now I don't want to describe on that, but then that changed the destiny of philosophy. And you can say after Plato, everyone was Platonic, and after Descartes, every philosopher became Cartesian, and after Kant, Kantian. And I won't say that to Heidegger and all, but this is the three major the pillars of philosophy. But then the Cartesian modernism, how it was established through the post-Cartesian philosophers like John Locke, George Berkeley, Hobbes, and in continent, Gassendi, and Diderot, and many others, but especially the first opposition from the British empiricism, Hobbes, Hume, and in Germany, Leibniz and Kant. So from what I mentioned earlier, many works on the problem of individuation. Most of the philosophical work in the modernity was about human mind. So you can see a series of essays concerning human understanding. So by John Locke and Hume, and then Leibniz writing a new essay concerning human understanding based on the debate with John Locke. And you can add Critique of Pure Reason also. It's about the mind. It's a kind of dissecting the mind and the faculty of knowledge and the reason. So the nature of philosophy changed after Descartes. So it became a philosophy of mind predominantly, and the philosophy of object or the philosophy of nature, which was earlier Philosophia Naturalis, became the foundation of science. So the science and philosophy diverged from Descartes. Now, back to the first point. Is it possible? Should we limit this age of doubt and age of skepsis only to philosophy? Wasn't it a reflection of the society? And I would say it's clearly a reflection of the society. So philosophy had its assignment, its mission, its function. But more than that, it was the history and the literature that reflected this transition from an age of belief and age of all superstitions and blind submission to the church and the clergy, to how Panofsky, a great art historian Panofsky would call it, end of theocracy and the beginning of anthropocracy. The end of the rule of God and the beginning of the rule of man. And I would here mention three great works in literature, evolved in the same time, emerged in the same time with Descartes. Yeah, and you already know. So one is the Don Quixote of Cervantes in Spain, Hamlet, Shakespeare, many works of Shakespeare, and Faust. Of course, Goethe wrote Faust later, but the original Faust was from that time. The Marlowe was this time. So if you observe these three works, you can see the kind of proto-forms of Cartesian negation which happened in philosophy. And again, this didn't happen in a kind of 100 or 50 years of transition in the Renaissance. No? As you all know, the Renaissance was the darkest period of European history. So though it is called Renaissance, the rebirth of the Greek culture, if you follow the history, all over Europe, so take Spain, that was the end of Reconquista in 1492, and immediately after Reconquista, it's lasted some 400 years, the expulsion of Jews and the introduction of Inquisition and load of atrocities in Spain and the imperialism. So, you know, the conquering the America and Latin America and all. Then in England, and all this instabilities and the religious wars between Protestants and Catholics and treasons and beheading one after another the queens and the kings. And that actually produced Shakespeare. Yeah. And in Germany, clearly the Reformation and many other things. So there is a kind of, we call it a zeitgeist, a spirit of time or a paradigm in the history, and that reflected in the society and that influenced both literature and philosophy. So I think therefore I am, and all other things I have to negate, including the God. And the same way, the first rational man, the Hamlet, doubting to be or not to be. Yeah? So if you are not rational, you don't have that problem. Yeah? So you know only a to be. Yeah? And the Faust, this quest for knowledge and unsatisfied with the scholarship and the idealism and all. And the Don Quixote, this imagining the chivalry and all this, and the futility of wars. And Spain is particularly interesting because Spain had a clear history at that time. It is not just that Cervantes wrote Don Quixote in the 16th century. It has a long history. And that starts from the Reconquista of Spain through the military orders like Calatrava, Evora, Santiago de Compostela, and many others. And after the Templars almost disappeared, and they re-emerged as Freemasons later. But that history I don't want to touch because it's a background history. So what happened was these military orders, and particularly the Calatrava, they were almost absorbed to the Spanish army in the 16th century. So these knights, they fought for a high ideal, to free Spain from the Moors, and also other ideals, but they witnessed something else towards the end of 15th century. The Catholic kings, the Ferdinand and Isabel, with all their ambitious program of imperialism, they created the Spanish army and absorbed or annexed all the military orders. And that created a lot of confusion among the knights. Yeah? And they started questioning their own existence and their own ideals and the future of Spain, and then the ethics of Inquisition and the use of language. So there are a lot of literature on that. You know? And this has produced the 16th century where Spain was in power, but at the same time, someone like Cervantes is writing about the futility of war, yeah? About this all imaginary knighthood and other things. So I just want to highlight this parallel emergence in literature and philosophy in a very interesting period. And we all think that the birth of rationalism in Descartes, I mean, we tend to think that the reason is always born in a favorable conditions of rationality. So if there is a kind of incubation time of rationality, and naturally the outcome would be the reason. No, reason was born in violence. The reason was always born in oppression, violence, slavery, misery, wars, revolutions. So that is a kind of dialectic relation. So you cannot simply trace it back to the rationality. So then we can also hope that this age of oppression will also lead to a new age of reason. Okay, from that, I just want to move into the three forms of enlightenment, three traditions of enlightenment in Europe, and followed by a literary tradition. And it's clearly first the English, and then the French, and the German. So I focus mostly, this is the last part of my talk. the French Revolution and its impact, and then Napoleon, and the impact on the German philosophy and literature as represented from Aufklärung, Enlightenment, then Sturm und Drang, and then Classic and Romantic. But as a major framework, I want to emphasize here the Cartesian legacy in the early modern Europe, and from Descartes to Kant, the establishment of a transcendental framework in philosophy. So the Kant's philosophy is transcendental, that is from subject to the object. So he calls it a Copernican revolution. I mean, we are not orienting to the object, but the objects have to be oriented to our knowledge. This transcendentalism as a paradigm was established over a period of 400 years, I would say. It is not just that Kant introduced that, from Descartes to Kant and further. So transcendental philosophy or transcendental subjectivity as a paradigm, and the later 19th century, how that begins to crack down, fail. So the cracks in subjects, the failing subject, and you can clearly see in Nietzsche, for example, and in the 20th century. Yeah? And this development was adequately exemplified in literature. So that was, interestingly, before Kant, the exemplum, giving examples, was quite common in philosophy. But with Kant, it became almost a norm that you don't have to, you're not supposed to use exemplum. And that assignment was taken over by the literature, the same way the science taking over Philosophia Naturalis. So we have this various literary epochs in Germany. For example, the Enlightenment with Kant, and was ist Aufklärung, what is enlightenment, and where he defined the enlightenment and this courage to think for yourself, not to outsource your thinking to somebody else, yeah, and differentiating between private and public reason and all. I'm not going to elaborate on that, the critique of pure reason. And we have Lessing with the representative of Aufklärung, the Enlightenment, with the Emilia Galotti and Nathan the Wise and all. And interestingly, the German literary epoch, there's a very dialectic progression. Then we have the Goethe and Schiller in Sturm und Drang, opposing all this enlightenment and this overpowering rationalism. And then the classic, where there's a kind of synthesis that happened between these two poles, and the romantic then opposing the classicism. And finally, the advent of the industrial societies and its reflection in realism and naturalism, and then the transition of naturalism to the symbolism. And Nietzsche as a philosopher, that actually you can place it in this phase of transition. I just want to, very interesting, I mean, because the Malayalis are so familiar with the film tradition, just to give one more reference to my earlier point of Seventh Seal of Ingmar Bergman. Yeah, so that was shot, that portrays the 14th or 13th century after the Crusades. So the Antonius Block returning back to Sweden after the Crusades, and obviously the Crusades were all failures. The knights all over Europe were somehow almost seduced by the clergy and the Pope to fight against the Muslims in Jerusalem. So this experience, and if you can see in the film, he confessed to someone thinking that it's a priest, but it was death. Yeah. So and his problem was the Antonius Blocks. He wants certainty. Yeah, and he wants a certainty of knowledge. So this is just a reference which would be very interesting, how this Cartesian skepsis can be traced back to the medieval age. Okay, moving from that to this modern age, the 19th century, it's so interesting to see how this transcendental subjectivity established through various enlightenment and philosophies and in literature started failing towards the end of 19th century. Yeah? And that change, as reflected in the society, had a clear impact on philosophy and literature. Yeah. So I'm skipping the romantic part. It's very interesting if you read that. There's various representative, especially that was a time in Germany where one can find a clear nexus between philosophy and literature. The German idealism, Fichte and Schelling and Hegel, and later the many proponents of like the philosophy of Fichte, and among the literary figures, for example, Novalis, Hamann, Schlegel, all great founders of Romanticism were also philosophers, in the German tradition. So moving from that tradition, I would argue, with Nietzsche there is an unusual turn in the Romanticism. It is not Romanticism is one movement in Germany which has different phases. There's an early Romantic, middle Romantic, Spät Romantic we call it. Spät Romantic with E.T.A. Hoffmann and the middle of the 19th century. But you can include more and more figures in that. And what happens with Nietzsche, this heritage, his philosophical upbringing, for example, he was a classical philologian and he read Schopenhauer extensively later. And then the influence of Richard Wagner, and the Wagner who clearly belonged to the Romantic tradition. But then you can see a Nietzsche struggling to emancipate from the philology to become a philosopher. So the early works of Nietzsche, for example, The Birth of Tragedy and The Untimely Meditations, and about truth and falsity in an extra-moral sense. So you can find how critical he is towards Plato in the Greek tradition, towards Kant, and to the modernity in general. So first of all, the role of language is being questioned. The language is not an adequate expression of the truth. So because the language creates metaphor and all these things. And I cannot explain all these things. But then a few examples. First of all, the split in subject. That was one of the major contributions of Nietzsche. And he paved way to the future psychologism. First of all, the Dionysian and Apollonian split in The Birth of Tragedy. So again, extrapolating that into art, that the plastic art and the music. So he asked in Geburt der Tragödie, The Birth of Tragedy, what can overcome the power of appearance, the shine of plastic art, the sculpture, and sculpture is an Apollonian art, and reduce that and depotence that into symbol. So that is how to depotence the power of this plastic art into a symbol, and that is music. So the music for Nietzsche is a Dionysian art. So another observation is again about the aesthetics. So it is our existence and the world, they are eternally justified only as an aesthetical phenomenon. So that is a clear negation of the entire tradition of Cartesian and Kantian philosophy. It is not the moral or the virtues and the moral, etc., and the ethics that defines the human existence. So we are not justified as an ethical phenomenon eternally. We are eternally justified as an aesthetical phenomenon. Then the question is, what is aesthetics in Nietzsche? So he even says that the artist becomes the artwork. So, you can see how the literature is again reaccommodated in philosophy through Nietzsche. And as a matter of fact, the German tradition still doesn't recognize Nietzsche as a philosopher. Even Gadamer said he is not pedantic enough, or nicht genügend pedantisch. He's not there's no enough pedantry in Nietzsche to become a philosopher. Whereas the French tradition, of course, really admired him as a philosopher. That's another question, what can be a philosophy and all. But there are various aspects in Nietzsche like this, his development from the early phase of Birth of Tragedy into the middle phase, where he began to recognize the Apollonian appearance, but in a different form of mask. So he says that around an individual, a mask is constantly growing and all. And all his criticism of the culture and the vision of the future culture, etc., etc. And one important thing is, it starts from the early Nietzsche, the famous essay on Über Wahrheit und Lüge im außermoralischen Sinne, about truth and falsity in extra-moral sense. Later, he had this observation that I, the subject, is not the absolute. So then you can clearly see the influence of Schopenhauer here, yeah, because Schopenhauer subject the human subjectivity to will. So there is some other principle. So for Nietzsche, there is a bigger I behind me that pushes me to do all these things. So you can see the advent of psychologism there. You know, there is something behind me, and Gross's ish, yeah, a bigger I that actually influence my own subjectivity to do this. So then he says, a thought comes not when I want, but when it wants. And Gedanke kommt nur wenn will, nicht wenn ich will. If you can follow from that, the thoughts are not thought. You cannot even think your thought. The thoughts should come to you. So there is something else in you, in your individuation, yeah, that facilitates that emergence of thought in you. You cannot think your thought, all these things. So, but that is the way his, then he asks, wie viel Erkenntnis braucht man? Wie viel Wahrheit braucht man? How much truth do we need to lead a better life and all? So there is a clear pragmatism in Nietzsche. So just like his treatise on history, the use and abuse of history for life. Yeah? And it's always the knowledge for life, truth for life, historical consciousness for life. So they call it a life philosophy. So there you can see how literature re-entering the philosophy in a way. But then after Nietzsche, so there is a kind of again a dark age in the European history. And so I'm not going to go into the details because 20th century is so close to you that you know it already. With Heidegger and again phenomenology, again trying to continue at the same time overcome this transcendental framework of Kant and failing miserably. And then comes Heidegger with the fundamental ontology or the being and time. And the early 20th century, if you follow, it's so clear that you have the French intellectuals, the writers, the philosophers, and the German in Europe. For example, all this, the Camus and Samuel Beckett, and in art from the transition from figurative to non-figurative art. So there are very interesting essay by Merleau-Ponty about the doubting Cézanne and how, and other works, and how the tradition of art changed. I mean, the late Cézanne, where the forms became more symbolic, yeah, and then it led to the Cubism of Picasso, and then Piet Mondrian, and further. And the early 20th century with the two wars and the birth of Expressionism, and in the film and art and literature and all. So the philosophy has a clear parallel history in this, and including Heidegger and others also. So to conclude my talk, I just want to summarize, just want to highlight a few points which I've been trying to explain. First of all, as a discipline, philosophy will maintain its autonomy. There's no doubt about that. So you can name different traditions, like, even philosophers like Habermas, or even still say that I'm not a sociologist, I'm a philosopher. No? But the fact that there is no one way of philosophizing, which is very clear. So this is a kind of academic notion. Among the academics, philosophy needs a particular language, and it is not literature, etc., etc. Now the second thing is, it is in principle ahistorical, because it refers to the being, finally, but it is historical. It is historical and based on the culture. Yeah? So in German we have a term, Geistesgeschichte, that means intellectual history, that includes many traditions of thoughts from various disciplines. So not just philosophy, from other disciplines also. Yeah? Third, the relation between philosophy and language. So then we have clearly a philosophy of language, a great tradition in philosophy of language also. Yeah, we had a professor in Freiburg who was a student of Martin Heidegger. He once said, what is after all philosophy? 90% philology and 10% footnotes, he said. But that is not entirely true. And I always believe philosophy is one discipline that transcends the language, that goes beyond the limit of language. Because language is logos, it should be spoken or read. But philosophy can be a philosophy of nothing, like Heidegger's philosophy. Yeah? So it has various expressions. It can be a philosophy of sensation. It can be a philosophy of object or anything. So it is something which is not subject to language. Yeah? Same way with literature. Yeah? So these are all very debatable issues in philosophy. But still, most of the universities have their first faculty as theoretical philosophy, where you mostly discuss the theoretical foundation, that is ontology and epistemology. Then there is logic, and then ethics and aesthetics. These are the modern classification of philosophies. And of course, in the theoretical philosophy, you'll be dealing mostly with the question of being, the question of knowledge, and the modes of being and the modes of knowledge, etc., etc. Yeah, but then to have a kind of not a holistic view, a more pragmatic view of philosophy, we have to take into consideration the society, the time, the people, and it's just like I would use an analogy. Not that I wanted to include that analogy in science. Philosophers are like astrologers. Yeah. So what an astrologer would say, based on the positions of the planets, your future would be like this. So it's a speculation. I'm not saying that philosophy is a speculation. In the same way, the philosophers also collect facts from the society and the time. And there is no doubt that Napoleon influenced Hegel. Napoleon and French Revolution influenced Kant. Kant openly supported, except the guillotine or the beheading the king, and which Hegel even supported. Yeah? And the impact of Napoleon on European literature, you can't overlook that. Yeah? So these are even Hegel saying absolute spirit on horseback, or even for Nietzsche, the Übermensch is closer to Napoleon. See, these concrete examples are there, but still philosophy is not distilled out of that, not derived out of that. It is connected with a long history and long tradition, yeah, so with Plato and Aristotle, but at the same time it gains its momentum, it gains its spirit and life from our time and from our society. Yeah. So it's not that philosopher is blind to this society, as compared to a writer or a poet and all. The mode of expression is different. It's just like the building construction. It is more fundamental. In a surgery, it is not cosmetic surgery. It's a deep cut. Yeah. And one last point, and I stop my talk with that. It's so interesting. I was explaining about the establishment of transcendentalism, and one phenomenon in 19th century was the naturalism in literature. So the naturalism was influenced by the natural sciences, like it's a major literary movement, like in Germany, like Ibsen and Strindberg and Zola and Tolstoy and Gerhard Hauptmann in Germany. And so they were so influenced, and the philosophical part with the Auguste Comte and Ernst Mach and many others. So the philosophy has to follow the principles of natural science. So that's the point. What are those principles? It's the principle of causation. Everything has a cause. Everything is determined through fate, through social circumstances, through upbringing, like the Ibsen's Ghost, yeah, or Miss Julie of Strindberg, and all these things. But then this determinism of natural science, so the causation is the absolute. But what happened after Nietzsche? Yeah, still they maintained the naturalistic element, but it became symbolic, it became expressionistic, without cause. So that is the most frightening thing of Heidegger, the angst, the anxiety has no cause. Or Camus' absurdity has no cause. Yeah, so like one figure in Waiting for Godot say, man, you are on earth, there's no other solution, you have to use your intelligence. So they are not giving any causal nexus. There's no cause, but still there is, at the surfacing anxiety. And that became one of the major features of expressionism, especially in film. Think of a film like Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. So there's a work by Siegfried Kracauer, From Caligari to Hitler. Yeah? So Caligari using the Caesar, the somnambulist, to kill others. Yeah? So that lacking causation is as a transitional phenomenon from naturalism to symbolism was already there in the Nietzsche's philosophy, I would argue. Because you cannot trace it back to the causes, even though the Freudian and other psychology tried to find the causes. Yeah? So these are the points of connections between very deeply rooted social realities and social developments and philosophy and the literature. I hope I've explained to some extent. Yeah? Sorry about the obscurity and because a lot of reference and I'm not in a position to explain all the references. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Thank you for your wisdom. There's, of course, the case of Jean-Paul Sartre, Camus, Bertrand Russell, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, being philosophers. I wish there was a Nobel Prize for philosophy as well. But I was wondering why you didn't go beyond the 20th century, early 20th century, and did not even include Marx in your presentation. And also, I was wondering why you limited yourself to Western tradition, not to the non-Western Indian or other traditions of philosophy. And there, what is the relationship of literature and philosophy? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, so the only thing, I have only 1 hour to speak, first of all. Secondly, I can only speak on things which I know. I'm not very competent in the non-Western traditions. I know them to some extent, but to give a very detailed account of that, I'm not competent. And about Marx, it's because I thought probably the audience in Kerala, it's so evident this because they are quite familiar with this development, and it's a very interesting figure, and it would be, I mean, as an example for this, be more than adequate. Yeah. And how philosophy progressed in history. There is a difference between science and philosophy. Philosophy has this, constant negation and development, a kind of dialectics there. So, like our professors used to say, to work on a philosopher means to fight with the philosophers. You have to negate the tradition. Not always. You can also refer to the tradition and support and all. And Marx being the greatest philosopher of reversal, that Hegelian and then this instinct to like the consciousness and being. It is not that that consciousness evolving out of social states, all these things. And these could be perfect examples for my talk. But I avoided that because I want to focus largely on this nexus between literature and society. And then transcendentalism as a paradigm, and Nietzsche, Kant, and Nietzsche and Plato and all. And the fields where I feel more comfortable to talk.
Can you talk about the difference between continental and analytical traditions of philosophy? And can you say something about Frankfurt School and Adorno?
No, I cannot. Because you're asking something which needs a lecture series for example. But then, see, this is again a problem in philosophy. I know even analytical tradition, the origin was in continent. Thinking of Wittgenstein or Frege, Russell, of course, still the continent. No, I don't know this in England. But then, Frankfurt Schule, definitely I cannot, because I worked on that, but I'm not very confident to talk about it. But then there is a tendency in philosophy. There is a kind of interplay between two great traditions. Yeah, so there's always a resurgence of Platonism in philosophy, the Platonic and Aristotelian. Yeah, that's why the philosophy always had this two poles and interchanging. So, the Aristotelian school establishing and overcoming the Platonic, and the Plotinus re-establishing Neoplatonism, and then Augustine. And in the medieval scholasticism, again, it was originally the Platonism and then the Aristotelianism of Thomas Aquinas and all. And with Descartes is again, an attempt to negate the entire past and the scholastic tradition, but at the same time deriving most of the principles from the scholastic tradition. Yeah, but again there is a kind of, I would say, the ghost of mathematical formalism in philosophy, the dominance of mathematics with Descartes, yeah, with Nicolas von Cusa, with Plato, yeah, and still even today. So these are the schools that somehow draw their inspiration and the fundamental principles from the Greek tradition, the Plato and Aristotle. Yeah, but then you don't have to differentiate like that. You can still see when you read Aristotle, the Platonic foundations of Aristotle, and the later Aristotelianism, how Platonic these are. So there is a kind of, even in the conflict, there are more similarities and commonalities among in philosophy. Yeah. If there are no more questions, then fine.
As a token of our love, we would like to give Dr. Babu Thaliath a memento. I invite K.G. Paulo sir to do the honors, and I request Dr. Babu sir to receive the same. With this, we come to the end of the session. I thank Dr. Babu Thaliath sir for sharing his valuable thoughts and time to us. Thank you all.